Ready? If someone has been using cycles for several years and wants to get off for good, what is a good PCT protocol? I know that erectile dysfunction, sex drive, natural production, and luteinizing hormone will be shot, and it will take more than the typical post-cycle therapy. So, wondering, should they do a couple rounds of PCT with small breaks between, or a higher dose PCT, or a longer PCT? Should they look into triptorelin over HCG or some other thing? Forgot in last email to mention. 40-year-old male, 200 pounds, 15% body fat, cycles twice a year, approximately 750 milligrams, presumably of testosterone weekly, and 400 milligrams decadroblin for 12 weeks. So, boy, what is a good PCT protocol? First of all, at 40, I would come off like you have, and maybe after 3 months, if you can make it that long, if you're still feeling okay, test your levels to see where you're at, because at 40, more than likely, certainly if you have symptoms, like you mentioned, that are possible anyway, you didn't say if you have them or not, you've got low testosterone. Just because of age, not because of all the other stuff.
Right.
I use the example, females who use oral birth control, right, to disrupt their production, their natural production of estrogen and progesterone, and believe it or not, testosterone also gets disrupted. You can see it almost invariably when they go on and off. They go off of the oral birth control and their hormones reequilibrate, not to exactly where they were, because let's say 10 years have passed and they started at 24, now they're 34, but they will go back to a level that would equal something they would have produced had they not done any oral birth control, is my point. Guys do the same thing. The issue is to what degree are you willing to suffer? Because testosterone is a different hormone, and the side effects of deficiency are different than the side effects of not having enough progesterone or estrogen, enough to disrupt your menses and whatnot, so as a contraceptive measure. So you've got options at any age. You have the same options really, but I would argue at 40, you're less likely to be successful than if you were, say, 25. But you can use an indirect method using a SERM, like tamoxifen, or enclomiphene, not clomiphene. You could use HCG, which is a more direct method. I mentioned this in the prior question about just telling the testicles to do something. One advantage to using HCG is that you could use HCG while you're still using your replacement dose, or your whatever your dose you're using, that's exogenous and stopping your body from producing specifically. You're not going to get a signal from the pituitary, and therefore your testicles are not going to produce. So you can override that and tell your testicles to produce anyway, because I know I've said this before, I liken the pituitary to a gas engine that will start right up as soon as it gets a signal to do so. But the testicles, depending upon how long they've senesced, how long they haven't been in use, are like diesel engines, take them a little bit longer to get going again. So get them going before you pull the T, and then when they get the signal from the pituitary, you should have a shorter period to suffer before things are up and running again. Though the period during which you'll suffer is pretty much related to the chronicity of use. How long you've been on a cycle, he's calling it, how long you've been on TRT, if for any reason you ever want to come off, and your age. You will have a longer period to wait before your testicles and pituitary, et cetera, come back online, with either of those being higher, meaning the time on and your age. So I guess that's really the only trick that I could share here, given what he's saying he's doing. And so maybe start, let's say 6 weeks before you plan to come off would be a very safe measure. 3 weeks, kind of a minimum, to get the testicles working again. Once you were off of the testosterone or anabolic steroid, then you can consider using the secondary method where you're blocking estrogen reception and then the body will be stimulated to send a signal to make more testosterone, the precursor to estrogen. We've gone over how that works before, right? Okay. That's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Doc. All right.
Hey, Dave. Let's see. I'm 56 and been lifting for 29 years now. Love it and won't stop. God bless you. Recently, I started various peptides and HGH. All was going well for the first 6 weeks. Then, bam, I started developing a rash during my workouts. It goes away after an hour or so, and Benadryl. I stopped the peptides and the rash was gone. Now it's started with the HGH. Have you heard of such a thing, and any advice on how to handle? Thanks, Troy B. So this one does happen somewhat frequently with peptides, and it could be from the peptide itself. I've seen it happen with Samorelin, for example, when Samorelin first came out. Well, not when it first came out, that was a long time ago, but when it was first starting to be used by people other than with dwarfism, for bodybuilding purposes and for health purposes otherwise. There's a significant fraction of the population that either has an allergy or develops an allergy. And oftentimes you'll see it locally, not so much systemically like he's talking about. And people will, for example, move the injection site around, and every time they do their next injection, the old spot will light up, not as much as the new spot, and down the line for a week, less so each spot prior to. It doesn't seem to affect the potency. In other words, you'll still get the benefit you're looking for with, for example, Samorelin, the growth hormone release, but you have this allergy that in general, and everyone's different, tends to go away with time. I've seen it usually about 3 months. It can last that long.
Wow. And
that can be miserable, especially if they're really itchy, the injection site. Now, this sounds like it's all over, and the fact that it is resolved with Benadryl and antihistamine makes it, pretty much a slam dunk, the diagnosis that this is an allergic reaction.
Okay.
And again, I've seen it before. Growth hormone is also a peptide. So, I think, and now I'm going to quote my friend Nelson Virgil, who told me that he read, and I haven't, stepped into the literature myself, but about 25% of the population using growth hormone can have an allergic reaction to it, can have allergies to it.
Oh, wow.
Which may be why some people, are miserable even though they're getting ripped and, or getting whatever they're trying to get out of growth hormone, and just don't tolerate it and can't stand it despite the other benefits. And that would make sense. The body, if, I'm reaching here, but if there was some breakdown in the peptide, I think this is a reach, but just like with leaky gut, the way that leaky gut works, if you've got a protein that normally passes through the cell wall the proper way, it gets broken down into component parts. And for example, with a peanut protein, the body recognizes it as its component parts. If you have leaky gut, it slides through without being broken down, and it's the same substance, let's say a peanut protein, but the body hasn't seen that before in that structure, so it can have an allergic reaction to it. I think I'm going to reach if I say that might be happening with peptides, because again, this isn't going through the GI tract, so it may just be the luck of the draw. In other words, that no matter how these are structured, that particular structure, in other words, somewhat denatured or not, that particular structure is just something that certain individuals have a reaction to. So I think this is a pretty easy one. It sounds like an allergic reaction. It should go away long term. Be careful with it because you don't want to have an anaphylactic reaction. Typically you will have those. That's a severe reaction where the blood vessels open up, blood pressure drops, and you can die. Okay, and that goes back to making sure that you're using a reliable source for your peptides or whatever drug you're using. A pharmacy should be a reliable source. They go through proper testing. etc. I'm talking about a compounding pharmacy, or of course even a brand. They all have to be tested the same way. So that might be part of it. It's not mentioned here if he's getting this from a peptide company, that's not licensed or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to be make it out like that. Just common sense. There's different rules, and you can depend on certain things here. I've said many times just to defend that, not defending doing anything illegally or anything like that, but. Business is business, whether it's legitimate or legal or not, and people don't want to screw up for business reasons. But you do have the added huge benefit and security if it's with a legitimate established company, because it cannot be released without going through proper testing. So, again, I'm going way off course, but this sounds like an allergic reaction thing. So you want to be careful, because you won't necessarily know in the first one. Actually, it's typically the second dose that'll zing you. You're teeing up your overreaction with the first dose, and then it's the second dose of something that you're allergic to in a major way that can get you. Sounds like he's been doing this for a while, so the likelihood of anaphylaxis is pretty slim. But just, again, in the interest of even an overabundance of caution, just know that those are things you got to look out for. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Doc. All right, what's next?
Thank you so much for answering my first question I emailed you. I have another question that I think a lot of people might want to know as well, with everything going on in the world.
Follow up.
Nice. First, when you take anabolic steroids, specifically Anavar, for 6 weeks and then stop, are you more prone to contract COVID-19? Also, can you get the COVID-19 vaccine while taking anabolic steroids, specifically Anavar? Are there certain precautions to take when you stop taking anabolics to keep from getting COVID? That's a good question. Thanks, Lindsay. See you. Oh, okay. Must be somebody. Oh no, this is you. Look at the end of the email. See it wrong. Okay, gotcha. So there is some research that shows that an overabundance of androgens can actually reduce the immune system. Okay.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but I think that's an overabundance issue more than anything else, because certainly we know, again, the poisons in the dose with so many things, that you're healthier to have an optimal amount of testosterone than if you had too little, and again, too much. So we don't talk about the dose here of Anavar that he's taking, but I think what's implied in the question is, more a direct cause and effect. If I take Anavar, am I more likely to get COVID? No, not if it's in a proper dose. You could arguably be more healthy. It's not something that's going to lower your defenses necessarily, and so you'd be more likely to contract it. From a more subtle standpoint, if you will, certainly anytime you throw your body off, if you were to come off of anabolic steroids, arguably, you're reducing your body's ability to recover, and like what do so many people do when they come off? Man, I don't want to lose my gains. I'm going to train twice as hard now, which is the exact opposite of what you should do, right? When you don't have the additional recovery ability, you got to back down as hard as it may be.
Right.
I love the thought, right, and the heart behind it, but it's the wrong thing to do. You can end up overtraining and reduce your immune system by overtraining. And I'm not talking about, well, certainly the official definition of overtraining, but what most people incorrectly use as overtraining. It's still, you're overdoing it. You can weaken yourself. But no, you're not at increased risk just because of Anavar. Now, we may even find out, I don't know of any research with Anavar, but we found out, for example, with tamoxifen, there's research showing that not in vivo, meaning not inside the body, but in vitro, in the test tube, that use of tamoxifen can reduce transmissibility, the viability of the virus by 1,000-fold.
Wow.
Who knows? We may find out without the testing. We won't know, or even I have never seen any sort of even modeling for this one. But Anavar might have something about it that makes it so you're more well protected. I don't know, but I wouldn't assume just based upon the basic physiology that's the issue. there's other things. Well, we've known that calcium channel blockers used for hypertension can help with other viruses, and we also showed with COVID in vitro that can help protect you.
Nice.
So yeah, who knows? Maybe it could actually be protective, but I wouldn't think just without knowing otherwise that it would harm you, except indirectly, like I mentioned. Okay.
Gotcha. Nice. All right.
He says, "Hi Dave, I'm a 45-year-old bodybuilder from England, and I'm looking to start a stack of Sustanon 250 every Monday and Thursday, and Deca 200 every Tuesday and Friday. I will take 0.5 milligram of anastrozole from the first day of injection, and continuing this until a month after my last injection. I will also be taking ACG around the 3 weeks and carrying on until about a month after cycle. I have good testosterone levels and would like to know if you think my natural testosterone levels will go back to normal after completing post-cycle therapy. Also, if 0.5 milligram of is 0.5 milligram of anastrozole a wise move, or should I take 1 milligram every other day?" Okay, this is another good question to get people to make use of their physicians. And if you don't have the ability, for example, in England, to make use of a physician, maybe you can make use of at least laboratory assays. In my experience, if you're going to be using that much testosterone and that much of an anabolic steroid, in this case decaduroblin, people, it's generally thought of that decaduroblin will not convert at all to estrogen. I think I read it in Llewellyn's book that I think about 20% of it will convert. I may be wrong where I read that, but it's still relatively minor, but you can have some conversion. But the point is, no matter what, you've got that 500 milligrams of 4 different esters of testosterone that can definitely convert. So the likelihood that you're going to get away with no AI or any sort of estrogen modulation is pretty slim. 0.5 milligram of anastrozole, I'm not sure. He says 0.5 milligram from the first day of injection and continuing this until a month. Does that mean to you every day he's taking 0.5 milligram?
Sounds like it, right?
Anyway, the point being that the best way is not to guess, but to test.
I know.
Right? Because everybody's different.
Right.
I've got a couple dozen patients that don't need to take any AI to keep their estradiol sensitive inside normal levels. Yeah. Well, that's rare. I mean, and I stopped counting it, a long time ago, 20,000 patients. So that's a very small percentage. But I've got guys that I remember when I first started with my first doc, I was taking anastrozole every day to keep mine within normal limits. Now I'm down to 1 milligram a week.
Okay.
And I've seen this with patients over time on TRT. In my experience, you can use less and less of it as time progresses. But anyway, again, don't guess when you can test.
Right.
Who knows if this is sufficient? And so, as soon as you get started, within a couple weeks anyway, I would consider getting some laboratory assays of your testosterone levels, free and total, as well as your estradiol sensitive, to see if it's doing the trick, and if not, adjust accordingly. As far as the PCT, yeah, that sounds like as good a move as any. I'm not sure that you'll need that much anastrozole for that long, but assuming you don't have side effects from oversuppression, it shouldn't be an issue for that short a time period anyway, and that's a fine way to do it. The HCG, the last 3 weeks, it sounds like, before coming off of that and then carrying on until about a month afterwards, again, that's as good a guess as any. I would say that's reasonable. In other words, you could start 6 weeks, you start 3 weeks, you could go 3 weeks or 6 weeks. It just depends upon the age and your natural function. I know it sounds like I'm dodging, but there's so many factors that the best way to know for sure is to test. Of course, how you feel too. I mean, do you really have to test for your testosterone levels? Not necessarily. And of course, you could always stretch out the ACG for a little longer if you're.
I was going to ask you, how long would you make it last? So let's say you started 3 weeks before you stopped the cycle. How long would you stay on it total before stopping? Do you go by your feel? Or?
Probably at least 3 weeks, probably
Okay.
closer to 6 weeks to be
Total, okay.
certain. The thing is, if you go cold turkey, your body's going to, your pituitary is going to start screaming at your testicles sooner or later. So if, in some senses, it could be even more efficient to get yourself back to your baseline, natural, that way, but probably more painful and undesirable all around. Yeah. So, you can smooth it out by stretching it on either end. Of course, the dose is important too. And again, I couldn't tell you, except generally, you could go as low as 250 IU every other day of HCG and be fine, or you might need to go as high as, I say need. You could ramp it up certainly with like a fertility dose of 3,000 IU every other day. And you'd have different results, presumably, depending upon the dose. So there are more factors than that. But in general, this is a pattern that makes sense. As you start to come off, get everything up and running again. And, until it is up and running again, continue to use that. And then, at that point, then the question might be, do I just stop the HCG cold turkey or wean? Generally speaking, I just say, stop, because at that point, presumably the testicle's up and running and the pituitary will send a signal as needed, so it shouldn't be a problem.
How often do you think, this is a good follow-up question, I think, let's say people, they're not doing TRT, they're just doing cycles, like this guy seems to be talking about, and then you do a 6 weeks, PCT with the HCG in the end. How many cycles does one should not, how many max cycles should they do in a year? Because a lot of time when we're younger, bodybuilders, they'll do cycles, depending on if they're competing or not. So what's safe and what's not safe? Or
what they call cycles. I remember a friend of mine who I won't mention, but
right.
And I've heard it from more than one bodybuilder. Oh, I'm off right now. Really? I thought you just told me you're doing 50 milligrams of androl a day. Well, yeah, that's off.
Yeah, exactly.
We're talking about being completely off
yes.
of everything, right?
Off, yeah.
And I'm not trying to make fun. It was just
no.
those are the days you're referring to. But
yes, exactly.
Standard of care right now is pretty much, well, first of all, for as long as you're on an anabolic, if at all possible. And what I mean by that is, okay, so what if you're on, say, nandrolone, decadrobolin, because of a wasting disorder, HIV, where, to get 20 more pounds on you or any kind of weight can be literally life-saving, right? First of all, boy, I'm going to open up a can of worms here I may not want to open, but, I argue that the rationale behind what's accepted as a standard of care is really, it should change soon because it's making some pretty bad assumptions. For example, we know that all anabolic steroids are going to lower so-called good cholesterol, HDL, and raise typically the so-called bad cholesterol, LDL. What we're finally coming to a head with is something that's been not intentionally, as far as I can tell, misconstrued for probably 80 years, and that is that while LDL cholesterol will further extent coronary artery disease, plaque buildup, it doesn't cause it. And that's a big line that's been made kind of a fine line and we've crossed, meaning people have said, oh, well, we've got to lower your LDL cholesterol no matter what for 80 years. And arguably, and I don't think he'll mind my mentioning him, but, Mark Penn, one of the top cardiologists in the world, used to work with Cleveland Clinic, I believe he's now with Quest, will say, we realize now it's more about inflammation. Okay, the spark for which LDL will then act as fuel for sure, but LDL is not the spark. And only, the top cardiologists really will know that these days. And I think that's all going to change, but that's important. And think about it, with the ketogenic diet craze, where everyone's eating tons of fat in this country, most of the fat we consume is saturated fat, so your LDLs are going through the roof. I've seen people on the ketogenic diet close to just under or over 200, LDL. So if that were the case, that LDL were driving plaque buildup, then we would have already seen people dying left and right from the ketogenic diet, and they're not. And I have plenty of patients that are on it, and we've done, they're old enough, which is, by the way, the biggest risk factor for coronary artery disease is your age. We don't talk about it because you can't change your age. Yeah. You can change these other things, so we focus on that, but that's your biggest risk factor. So I typically recommend doing some imaging, unless you have a first degree relative or something, some other condition that would warrant checking sooner. 50 years old, just like a colon cancer screening, let's look to see what's in the carotids, because there's the correlation between what's there and what's in the heart as a first pass. But anyway, I'm getting way off field. With I'm coming back to the use of anabolic steroids and why we want to see patients come off them if it's not for example, wasting, or arguably there are some patients that you might be on it basically for life. It makes sense. If we now realize that LDL is not a driver, and I should quickly add, by the way, that because it can fuel it, I mean, I'm going to steal from one of my old mentors, Dr. Jeffrey Gramer. The web page that says that reduction of LDLs, for example, using statins, doesn't work to stop, slow, or reverse coronary artery disease is right next to the one that says that no Jews were killed by Nazis in World War II and we haven't landed on the moon yet. I mean, this stuff does work, but when do you need to apply it? I wouldn't give you an antibiotic unless you had an infection, right? We don't need to get rid of LDL unless you've got an issue with it being around, okay? So point taken. So the fact that an anabolic steroid will change that lipid profile is not necessarily a concern, just across the board. But that's one of the main reasons. And then there's also issues with measurements of what most refer to as liver enzyme function. Okay, and this gets sticky because there is some effect on liver with certain, they call them C17, C19s, oral anabolic steroids, where you have a ligand that makes it harder to metabolize. Well, it makes it harder to metabolize, which makes it, that means the liver's working harder, and that, arguably taxes the liver. So you see some of the enzymes floating around, from the lysing of the cells. I'm giving you probably too much, but that's what we're picking up on. Well, the problem with that is AST and ALT can be elevated, particularly ALT, but AST also I've seen elevated from a number of other reasons, including, guess what? The number one thing is, number one source in a lot of people that happen to be taking testosterone replacement therapy or an anabolic steroid, muscle tissue breakdown. Mm-hmm. So you see elevations in these numbers where you have higher turnover because these guys are on TRT or anabolic steroids even more so, and you, oh my goodness, the liver enzymes are high. No, not necessarily. It could be for muscle tissue breakdown, which is why you can add something called a GGT, another assay that's specific to and doesn't include muscle tissue, but liver, pancreas, biliary tract, so that you can differentiate. You see, I've got an AST or ALT that's mildly above normal. It's not going to be off the charts. That is something to worry about. But if it's, it can almost look like fatty liver. And by the way, to confound it even more so, especially in the old days when guys didn't do that much cardio when they were working out, they would lift heavy, they wanted to bulk up and eat a lot and rest a lot, you could get a fatty liver. That's how we first started using what we now call the MIC caps. We started using inositol and choline, and lately we've added another methylator, L-methionine. But the guys of old, I told you the story before, Franco Colombo and those guys, that group, they knew to use that to clean the fatty liver out after an anabolic cycle. I don't see it so much anymore because guys are more cognizant of the fact that it could happen. But again, just to confound it even more, my point is not to say that it is necessarily the liver. It could just be from muscle tissue breakdown. And so the two main reasons why we say, okay, got to get off that, are not really what we thought they were anyway. Not necessarily real reasons to do so. And on top of that, and I've helped patients with this before, if you wanted to, you can actually make your lipid profile look better with most anabolics, the exception probably being stanozolol, because that just cuts your HDL in half in 3 days. And it's hard to adjust for that. But you can oftentimes make your lipid profile look better, at least from a cardiologist standpoint, not the top ones, but the ones that still believe that's the driver, with like red yeast rice for the LDL and HDL, thing like a controlled release niacin for the triglycerides. That would also lower triglycerides and help the HDL typically. So you can actually manipulate your lipid profile to look better while you're on than off in some cases. where was I going with all this? The standard of care right now is, first of all, for an equal time that you're on an anabolic, you want to be off it, because that's typically enough time where we can go and we can take labs and go, look, those numbers came back to normal, where they were before.
Okay.
A typical anabolic, they call them cycles, a course of therapy, because it takes, with anabolics, depending on which one and everything, 4 to 6 weeks before it even starts to kick in, as we say.
Yeah.
Typically a course is at least 8 weeks, not 6 weeks. I read earlier in a question, right? That's right about when it's first starting. And that's the way they used to do it a long time ago still. I remember reading about that when I was younger. But 12 weeks, 10 to 12 weeks, kind of the max. And then you're off for the similar amount of time. So what does that amount to? About two
cycles
per year at a max, right? For someone who needs it. Yeah.
Good answer. Good question. Thanks, Doc.
My pleasure.